Okay, so hello, my name is Ben Mulvey. Currently a PhD candidate in Hong Kong. And yeah, thanks for taking the time to listen to this short presentation, which is it's just about a recent paper that I published in Higher Education, entitled Semi-Peripheral Postcoloniality in the Discourse of International Student Mobility Between China and Africa. So the aim of the paper was to build on the existing work that's been done on the asymmetrical nature of international student mobility by drawing on the concept of semi-peripheral postcoloniality, which I'll explain kind of further on, to examine how specific modes of integration into the world system result in particular discursive formations around international student mobility. So to put that another way, how a kind of a country's position in the global political and economic order is kind of reflected in the discourse, the narratives that are created within that country around international student mobility. So yeah, student flows generally tend to favor, or historically tend to favor, Western countries over others, obviously. So obviously the main destination countries for international students are normally Anglophone Western countries, like the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, places like that. But one of the most significant shifts taking place with regard to international student mobility trends is that developing nations, to put that another way, countries in the global south, which were previously the largest source countries, so they sent the most students abroad of international students, are increasingly becoming destination countries and regional hubs for international student mobility. And China is the most obvious case. So China hosted nearly 500,000 international students in 2018. A large proportion of those students are from what can be considered peripheral post-colonial countries. So I'm going to explain a little bit more about what the term peripheral means later on. But so as an example, African students constitute the second largest regional grouping of students in China after Asian students, who obviously Asian students mostly study in China because, well, at least partly because it's close, but there was 81,562 students from African countries in China in 2018. Therefore, as Prezeres notes, the empirical focus of the vast majority of studies on international student mobility, which is on the West, is kind of problematic because we have so little understanding of what's happening in China at the moment. So yeah, the analysis begins from the premise that globalized higher education is highly unequal. So Altbach makes the distinction a while ago, 14 years ago now, made the distinction between powerful university systems in the global core and weaker institutions in the global periphery. So he argued that center-periphery relations between university systems resemble neo-colonial domination. So for this paper, the key contribution to the literature on international student mobility is that it extends and adapts Altbach's arguments by drawing on the concept of semi-peripheral postcoloniality, I think coined by Zoltan Janelli, to analyze how structural forces shape the nature of educational mobility between periphery and semi-periphery. So the concept is outlined through the example of international student mobility between countries in Africa and China. So the paper draws on post-colonial theory to examine international student mobility flows. So post-colonial theory is quite broad, but generally speaking, I'm aiming to highlight how the legacy of colonialism continues to shape unequal relationships between nations and between individuals. In terms of international student mobility, it tends to focus, the postcolonial theory, the literature which draws on that theory, tends to focus on how the legacy of colonialism drives international student flows from regions outside the Anglophone West to the West, and shapes international student experiences in Western host countries. There's a paper, Madge et al. 2014, so Claire Madge, they put it really succinctly. So the painful politics associated with colonialism and its past spatial relations, inequities and injustices are essential to shaping contemporary neo-colonial relations of education. So, yeah, the colonial relationships of the past shape international education today. A result of this is that existing frameworks cannot fully express the position of nations within the system outside the West. So I just wanted to kind of look at how China fits into this system and what is the relevance of post-colonial theory to migration to China. And obviously that's of importance given that non-Western countries such as China are now at the forefront of higher education internationalization in a number of ways. And more broadly, there's much more migration than there used to be to China. So it's important to understand China's relationship with the rest of the world. So the article draws on neo-Marxist approaches to the analysis of the global political economy. So world systems theory, essentially a meta-narrative of the historical development of a single global capitalist economy over time. The narrative highlights how nations and regional blocs interact in a global and hierarchical political economic structure, which has a core, or sometimes called the center and the periphery. So the hierarchy is flexible and changeable, and states currently in the semi-periphery, such as China, often attempt to augment their position, and higher education is part of the process. So I kind of combine that world systems theory with post-colonial theory. I think world systems theory, in a way, it's almost, there's some really significant challenges, especially when you look at the case of China, almost doesn't really, there's significant challenges to the theory now. But Zoltan Ginelli outlines the concept of semi-peripheral postcoloniality, which expresses how the long-term ideological and structural positions of countries, so positions within the world system, can serve to reproduce colonial relations and colonial discourse. So countries within the semi-periphery are relatively well connected to the global center, but in some ways remain subjugated to it. These countries have a strong urge to develop and catch up with and imitate the global core, and share the same sense of responsibility for the modernization of the periphery as the core does. So core countries, there's always a narrative of there's a responsibility amongst core countries to modernize the periphery. And in a way, you could almost make the argument that China is moving much closer to the center. It's a superpower. So whereas maybe 15 years ago it was part of the semi-periphery, maybe it's better to think of this as China's almost caught up with the West, and it's now kind of reproducing narratives that are common in the West with regards to peripheral countries. So rather than being a semi-periphery and reproducing it, it's the reason why the narratives are reproduced is because China's no longer really a semi-periphery. So with the concept of semi-peripheral postcoloniality, Giannelli provides the example of Hungary. He draws on the case of Hungary's development support to Ghana in the Soviet period, and argues that Hungary's anti-imperialist political solidarity with Ghana and other post-colonial peripheral countries was mixed with a kind of civilizational paternalism and pragmatic maneuvering in foreign policy. So there was a contradiction between Hungary's anti-imperialism, resulting from its position subjugated to the global core, but at the same time, there was a sense of kind of superiority and paternalism over the countries in the global south. And I basically think the same thing can be said of China. So as a result of its historical position, subjugated to the West or to the global core, there's a kind of anti-imperialism or an alternative kind of approach to countries in the global south, but at the same time there's increasingly a sense of superior in the narratives that come out of Chinese policy text, and there's a kind of increasingly a narrative of civilizational paternalism and pragmatic foreign policy. So how does this concept manifest itself in international student mobility? So in the past 2 decades, mobility for full degree programs, predominantly from developing countries in Asia to industrialized countries in the West, has fueled the growth of a global market for higher education and the concurrent growth of higher education as an important export industry, in particular for Anglophone Western countries. So at the same time, foreign direct investment from countries within the global core, along with the development of export economies, has driven demand within East Asian labour markets for the skills and knowledge associated with the manufacturing processes and business services that came out of that were moved from the global core to the semi-peripheries like China. So you can see the rise of international student mobility from Asia to the West. You can see it partly as a response to a demand for highly skilled workers in East Asia, which came about as a result of economic globalization and the economic domination of the global core over other regions. Furthermore, as a result of policy changes in the late 1980s, the vast majority of international students in Anglophone countries are enrolled on a user pay basis. So, for example, in the UK, overseas recruitment is a major source of income for the UK economy. So, therefore, just as the nature of the Anglophone West's integration into the world system leads to mobility from other regions to the West, the discursive formations or the narratives around student mobility in the West tend to reflect the position of the West within the structure. So recent literature has documented several manifestations of this. So Sharon Stein, for example, notes how in the West, the superiority of Western knowledge and education is presumed. International students are willing to purchase access to Western education in order to pursue social mobility. By extension, international students are often perceived to be in deficit in academic terms due to their national origin. And there's also a kind of developmental discourse with its roots in colonialism that exists with reference to higher education scholarships that are given out to countries in the global south. So the West has a responsibility to modernize non-Western countries. So at the same time, this whole process is reflected in what's happening with student mobility between African countries and China. So China's relative position within the global political economy acts as a pull factor for students from African countries, just as the West's relative position to East Asia did in the past. So as of 2016, China became Africa's largest trading partner, largest foreign job creator, and largest source of foreign direct investment. So as the volume of Chinese investment in Africa has increased, there's been a corresponding increase in the number of African students seeking to study in China. Obviously, partly due to the fact that knowledge and skills associated with study in China appear to be in demand across the African continent. So it appears that just as Western foreign direct investment between the 1970s and the 1990s led to demand for students with Western credentials and contributed to a rise in the number of Asian people studying for degrees in the West. At the same time, the recent explosion in Chinese investment in Africa has contributed to the flow of students from African countries towards China to study. And also the structural inequalities, so the sort of economic inequality that drives the student mobility between Africa and China is also mirrored in the policy and the discourse around the mobility. So there are two main examples which I wanted to quickly talk about. Firstly, the discourse around educational mobility between Africa and China, and secondly, the positioning of African students as diplomatic tools for the achievement of foreign policy goals. So the intention of the Chinese state to use higher education as a means of achieving foreign policy goals means that a relatively large number of full and partial scholarships are available for study in China, especially for students from Africa. So 63,000 students in total, not just from Africa, but all international students, received scholarships to study in China in 2018. And the pledge was made at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in 2018 to provide 50,000 government scholarships for higher education to African students over the period 2019 to 2021. The discourse around African international students in China sometimes appears to mirror the discourse between the West and other regions that has been described in the literature as neo-colonial. So there's kind of two contradictory messages within the discourses on the Chinese side. So firstly, there's a rhetoric of two-way exchange and win-win cooperation. So that kind of rhetoric implies that African students are part of an equal exchange. But at the same time, students from African countries in particular are constructed as recipients of help and aid from the Chinese government. So documents referring to African students specifically represent higher education scholarships given to them as one form of China's aid. So, as an example, a recent state media report on China's higher education scholarships describes how China offers a ray of hope for African international students. China's foreign ministry also released a report in 2017, and they describe the students as grateful to China. So there's a construction of African students as kind of grateful recipients of help, and China as a ray of hope for African students who want to study overseas. And at the same time, the continent of Africa, and by extension, the students that are from there are depicted as lagging behind and requiring assistance from China, that's positioned as a world leader in these narratives. So one quote from the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which kind of encapsulates that narrative. So this is the exact quote. "Africa still lags behind the rest of the world in the generation of new scientific knowledge. On the other hand, China has grown to become a world leader in scientific knowledge." So in other words, the documents appear to present Africa and African students in a way which effectively others them and reproduces the logic of Western higher educational aid to other regions, neo-colonial kind of logic. So China's higher education scholarships to African students are presented as win-win and on equal terms, but they actually further the asymmetric internationalization of higher education. So there's a contradiction. And at the same time, unlike in the West, the positioning of international students in China as sources of income is not dominant. However, through a kind of soft power rationale, African students are still positioned as tools with which the Chinese government can improve its cultural soft power. So whereas in the West, the primary construction of students is as cash cows or tools for making money, basically. In China, there's not really a export economy rationale at the moment, but students are still positioned as tools to further China's foreign policy goals. So I argue in this paper that there's something implicit in the soft power rationale for international student recruitment, a kind of sense of superiority over the countries that you're targeting in the global periphery. And it's definitely not on equal terms if students are being used as tools for foreign policy, to achieve foreign policy goals. So, for example, students are expected to learn Chinese, and graduation is conditional, according to the policy documents, on students passing classes on China's excellent traditional culture, is a quote from the Ministry of Education document. So the policy documents also highlight that universities should tap the resources of alumni, and that a key role of alumni is to tell China's story and spread China's voice. African students recruited by Chinese universities, according to Chinese policy documents, should also be future leaders and elites. So the soft power rationale reproduces inequalities and colonial relations in a number of ways. Implicit within it is the notion that knowledge flow should be largely within one direction. The implication is that international students don't have much to offer their hosts. And soft power as a rationale for international student recruitment actually has its roots in colonialism. So originally, students from Britain's colonies were given scholarships with the assumption that higher education was a means to guide the thoughts of colonial subjects. So that was the origin of this kind of international influence rationale for recruiting students. And that kind of logic, in order to guide the thought of students in order to kind of get favorable conditions in foreign countries, is mirrored in the assertion that African students in China should be future leaders of Africa. In addition, implicit in the rationale is an assumption that students will naturally develop positive attitudes towards their host country and its social and political conditions. That also appears to be true of China's attempts for China's rationale for recruiting international students. So that students would return home and would choose to spread China's voice, as it's put in the documents, is kind of taken for granted. So it implies that exposure to China through study abroad would be enough to cause students to develop positive opinions towards China and also to act on those positive opinions after graduation. So reproduces this rationale which has its roots in colonialism. So yeah, that was the presentation. Thank you very much for listening.